The cuffs bit into my wrists as I stared at the evidence bag on my kitchen table. My client files, my reputation, my life's work, all of it spread out like a crime scene. "These fraud charges could put you away for a decade," Deputy Mills said, his fingers tapping rhythmically against my tax ledgers. "Unless you want to tell us who else is involved." My daughter Emma stood frozen in the doorway, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. I had always taught her that numbers do not lie, that truth comes from precision, from balance. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking. I looked up at Sheriff Sheila, who leaned against my refrigerator with that familiar smirk, the same one she wore when she closed the hardware store after the owner refused to donate to her re-election campaign, the same one that appeared when the local newspaper publisher mysteriously received 3 health code violations in 1 month. "Tell your daughter not to worry," Sheriff Sheila said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "We just need to check if Daddy's books are as clean as he claims." That was when I realized the numbers would be my only defense, and her downfall. My name is Robert Winters. For 23 years, I have been the most boring man in Chester County. I am an accountant, a tax preparer, a keeper of financial records for the farmers, shop owners, and families who make up our small town of Millfield. My office sits on the second floor of my modest colonial home on Maple Street. Nothing fancy, just a room with 3 filing cabinets, a computer that I replace every 5 years, and a window that looks out onto the town square. Every morning, I make exactly 16 ounces of coffee, review my client calendar, and begin my day precisely at 8:30. Numbers have always made sense to me. They do not have hidden agendas. They do not harbor grudges. They either add up or they do not. In a world filled with uncertainty, accounting provides order, structure, the comfort of knowing that at the end of the day, when everything is properly categorized and calculated, the answer will be correct. My clients trusted me with their financial lives. The Peterson family farm, struggling through 3 years of drought but still making ends meet. Margaret's bakery, where the margins were thin but the books were immaculate. Even the town's only car dealership, run by the boisterous Jim Miller, who hated paperwork but loved the security my services provided. I never thought my profession would make me enemies. Tax code is not personal. It is the law, plain and simple. When Deputy Brian Nelson's brother came to me last year, I treated him like any other client. I reviewed his income statements. I cross-referenced his receipts. I applied the appropriate deductions. But when I noticed the extra income, nearly $40,000 with no corresponding W-2 or 1099, I did what I always do. I flagged it. I asked questions. I explained that I could not file a return with unexplained funds. That is not how I operate. He grabbed his papers and left without a word. I thought nothing more of it. Another client who decided against proper documentation. It happens every tax season. Some people prefer shortcuts. I do not judge. I simply refuse to be part of it. 1 week later, the first patrol car pulled into my driveway. Deputy Mills and Deputy Parker. I had prepared their returns in previous years, but they were not there as clients. Their faces were stone. Their hands rested near their holsters as if I were a threat. "Robert Winters," Deputy Mills said, though he knew exactly who I was. "We have a warrant to search your premises for evidence of tax fraud and conspiracy to assist in tax evasion." My heart dropped into my stomach. My hands began to shake, not from guilt but from the sheer shock of the accusation. In all my years of practice, not one client had ever been audited, not one filing questioned. My reputation was spotless. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "My practice is in full compliance with all regulations." Deputy Parker unfolded a document and held it up. "This says otherwise. We need all client files from the past 3 years, every receipt, every calculation, every note." I stood in my doorway as they entered, powerless to stop the invasion. They headed straight for my office, as if they had been given a map, as if someone had told them exactly where each file was kept. "Who filed this complaint?" I asked, following them up the stairs. "I have a right to know who is accusing me." Deputy Mills turned, his face betraying nothing. "This comes directly from Sheriff Sheila's office. Direct oversight. She wants every detail examined." And that was when I understood. This was not about taxes. This was about power, about control, about sending a message to anyone who dared question authority in Millfield. I watched in silence as they boxed up client files. Farmers who trusted me with their livelihoods, families who relied on my precision, small business owners who counted on my discretion. "This is a violation of client confidentiality," I protested, but my words fell on deaf ears. As they carried the boxes to their patrol car, I stood alone in my emptied office. 23 years of work, of trust, of reputation, all now in the hands of a sheriff with a reputation for using her badge as a weapon. I did not know it then, but this was not the end of my career. It was the beginning of a new one where the spreadsheets and formulas I had mastered would become something else entirely. They would become my defense, my evidence, and ultimately my justice. The sheriff's office smelled of cheap coffee and floor polish. I waited 43 minutes on a hard plastic chair before Sheriff Sheila Adams finally emerged from her office. She was tall, with short-cropped blonde hair and a perpetual expression of mild amusement, as if the world existed primarily for her entertainment. "Mr. Winters," she said, her voice carrying through the bullpen. Every deputy suddenly appeared busy with paperwork. "What brings our town's number cruncher to my department today?" I stood, straightening my tie. "I would like to discuss the search warrant executed at my home office yesterday. There seems to be a misunderstanding about my practice." She gestured lazily toward her office. The walls were covered with plaques and certificates, reminders of her authority in this town. She sat behind her desk, not offering me a seat. "No misunderstanding at all," Sheriff Sheila said, leaning back in her chair. "We received credible information regarding fraudulent tax preparation. Given your extensive client list, this could affect dozens of citizens in our community." "What evidence supports these allegations?" I asked, my voice steady despite the anger building inside me. She smiled, not the warm smile of reassurance, but the cold smile of someone holding all the cards. "That is not something I am at liberty to discuss during an ongoing investigation. Perhaps you should call a lawyer." The way she said it, the subtle emphasis on lawyer, was meant to intimidate, to remind me that legal defense costs money, time, reputation. She was not threatening legal action. She was threatening financial ruin. "My practice has been above reproach for over 2 decades," I said. "I have nothing to hide." "Everyone has something to hide, Mr. Winters," she replied, standing to signal the end of our conversation. "Even accountants." As I walked through the town square, my mind raced with calculations, not of tax brackets or deductions, but of power dynamics, of cause and effect. Sheriff Sheila had been in office for 6 years. 6 years of unchecked authority in a town too small to challenge her. I found myself at Wilson's Diner where I had lunch every Wednesday. Predictable, reliable, like my life had been until yesterday. Patricia Wilson, the owner, gave me a sympathetic look as I took my usual booth. "Heard about what happened," she said, pouring coffee without asking. "Seems like Sheila's making a hobby of it these days." "Making a hobby of what?" I asked. Patricia glanced around, then slid into the seat across from me. "Finding ways to hassle folks who do not play by her rules. Jackson's Hardware got 3 surprise health inspections last month after Steve refused to put her campaign sign in his window. The newspaper started getting parking tickets outside their office when they ran that story about the county budget." I sipped my coffee, letting the information settle. "Has anyone challenged her, filed complaints?" Patricia's laugh was short and bitter. "With who? She is the law around here. County commissioners will not touch it. Half of them got elected on her endorsement. The other half are too scared to speak up." Later that afternoon, I received a call from Thomas Green, the town accountant I had mentored years ago. His voice was hushed, nervous. "I cannot talk long, Robert," he said, "but you need to know you are not the first. Last year, Sheila went after the pharmacy when they questioned the department's billing practices, made a big show of investigating their prescription records. Nothing came of it legally, but they lost customers. People do not want to get their medications from a place under investigation." "What happened to the pharmacy?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "New owners took over 3 months later," Thomas said. "First thing they did was approve the sheriff's department's outstanding invoices. All of them. No questions asked." The pattern was becoming clear. Sheriff Sheila was not enforcing the law. She was using it as leverage, as a business model. By the end of the week, 3 clients had called to cancel their services. 2 more requested copies of their previous returns, clearly planning to take their business elsewhere. The whispers had begun. The doubt, the fear of association. I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by duplicate copies of the files that had been taken. 23 years of perfect records, of accurate filings, of honest work, all now under suspicion because one woman with a badge decided I was a threat. Emma found me there late that night, still reviewing statements and calculations I knew were correct. "Dad," she said, her teenage voice tinged with worry, "are we going to be okay?" I looked up at my daughter, 17, smart, observant. She had grown up watching me work, watching me believe in the system, in the order of things. "Yes," I said firmly, "we are going to be fine. Sometimes when the system fails, you have to find another way to make things balance." She nodded, not fully understanding but trusting my certainty. That night I made a decision. I would not run. I would not hide. I would not shout accusations or plead my case to deaf ears. I would do what I had always done when faced with a problem. I would analyze it, break it down, find the inconsistencies, the errors, the fraud. Sheriff Sheila thought she could use her position to intimidate me, to control me, but she had made a critical mistake. She had targeted a man who spent his life finding discrepancies in numbers, who knew that every transaction leaves a trace, who understood that in the end the books must balance. If Sheriff Sheila wanted to play a numbers game, I would show her what happens when the accountant decides to audit back. The county courthouse was an imposing brick building with white columns and high windows that caught the morning light. I had filed taxes here, notarized documents here, but had never before come with the intention I carried now. The records department was located in the basement, a fitting metaphor for how most citizens viewed government transparency. Down a flight of stairs, through a heavy door, into a room filled with filing cabinets and the distinct smell of aged paper. "I would like to request the financial records for the sheriff's department," I told the clerk. a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses. Specifically, the annual budgets, monthly expenditure reports, and procurement authorizations for the past 3 fiscal years. He looked up from his computer screen, momentarily confused. That is a lot of documentation, Mr. Winters. May I ask why you need all of this? Public records request, I replied, sliding a formally written letter across the counter. As a taxpayer and citizen of this county, I have a right to review how my tax dollars are being allocated and spent. The clerk nodded slowly. It will take time to gather everything. Some of these reports may be redacted for security purposes. I understand. I will wait. 3 hours later, I left the courthouse with a stack of photocopied budgets, expenditure reports, and procurement logs. Not everything I had requested. Certain documents required additional approval, but enough to begin my work. For the next week, I transformed my dining room into an investigative headquarters. I taped large sheets of paper to the walls, created timelines, spreadsheets, cross-referenced vendors and purchase orders. I worked with the precision that had defined my career, but now with a purpose that went beyond simple tax preparation. The first discrepancies were subtle. A fuel expense report listing 430 gallons for patrol cars in a month when the mileage logs only justified approximately 320 gallons. A training equipment purchase that was authorized, funded, and then apparently purchased again 3 months later with no record of return or exchange. Small inconsistencies that, taken individually, might be dismissed as clerical errors. But when mapped across 36 months of financial activity, they formed a pattern, a deliberate pattern. I needed more. The public records gave me the outline, but I needed the details, the signatures, the authorizations, the names. Jennifer Barnes had been my client for 8 years. She worked as an administrative assistant at City Hall, helping manage municipal records. When I called her to ask if we could meet for coffee, her voice was hesitant. "I heard about what is happening, Robert," she said. "Most people in town hall are avoiding the subject. They do not want to get involved." "I am not asking anyone to get involved," I assured her. "I just have some questions about public record procedures." We met at a coffee shop 2 towns over. Jennifer nervously stirred her latte, eyes darting to the door each time it opened. "People are afraid of her, Robert," she said quietly. "Not just because she carries a badge, because she remembers, holds grudges, finds ways to make life difficult for anyone who crosses her." "I am not asking you to cross her," I said. "I just need to understand the financial approval process for the sheriff's department. Who signs off on expenditures, who reviews procurement requests, who audits the monthly statements." Jennifer sighed, then leaned forward. "That is the problem. The oversight is minimal. The county commissioners approved a streamlined process 3 years ago. Sheriff Sheila has discretionary approval for anything under $10,000. Monthly reviews are conducted, but they are essentially rubber stamps. No one wants to question the woman responsible for public safety." "And who handles the actual disbursement of funds?" I asked. "Finance department. But they only verify that the paperwork is complete, not that the expenses are legitimate. They do not cross-check patrol logs against fuel purchases or verify that equipment was actually delivered." This was the crack I needed. The separation between approval and verification, between authority and accountability. The next day, I contacted Mary Hughes, a former classmate who now worked in the county finance department. I did not tell her what I was looking for, only that I needed to understand the payment processing system for county departments. "Each department has its own approval chain," Mary explained over the phone. For the sheriff's office, most expenditures are pre-approved within their annual budget. Sheriff Adams submits a request, it gets logged, and payment is issued. Vendors are paid, receipts are filed. And who verifies that the goods or services were actually received? I asked. A pause. The department head signs a receipt confirmation. In this case, Sheriff Adams or one of her designated deputies. So theoretically, I said, keeping my voice casual, if someone wanted to authorize payment for something that was never delivered, they could simply sign the confirmation themselves. Another longer pause. Technically, yes. That is why we have trust in our department heads, plus annual audits. When was the last full audit of the sheriff's department conducted? The answer did not surprise me. 4 years ago, before Sheriff Sheila consolidated her power, before the streamlined approval process. Armed with this understanding, I returned to my wall of financial data. Now I knew where to look, what to look for. I began cross-referencing vendor names with state business registrations, checking payment dates against delivery confirmations, comparing equipment inventories against purchase orders. The pattern grew clearer, more deliberate, more damning. 3 fuel cards assigned to vehicles that had been decommissioned. Office equipment purchases that far exceeded the department's needs. Training seminars that either never occurred or cost half what was claimed. Emergency expenditures for critical equipment repairs that somehow always fell just below the threshold requiring additional approval. Over 3 years, I identified more than $60,000 in questionable expenses, money that disappeared into the black hole of departmental discretion. I organized my findings into a detailed report, 27 pages of forensic accounting, of financial archaeology, digging through the layers of bureaucracy to expose the truth buried beneath. As I composed the cover letter to the state controller's office, I felt no satisfaction, no vindication, only a deep sadness that someone entrusted with public safety had betrayed public trust, that an office meant to uphold the law had become a vehicle for exploitation. I made 3 copies of the report, one to mail anonymously to the state controller, one to keep secured in my home safe, and one to hold in reserve for when the time came that truth would need to speak loudly. The hammer was about to fall, and Sheriff Sheila had no idea it was coming. No idea that her greatest threat was not a rival politician or an investigative journalist, but a quiet accountant with a talent for finding discrepancies in the numbers. The morning after I mailed my report to the state controller's office, I created a new spreadsheet. Not the kind I normally built for tax calculations or financial projections. This one was different, more complex, more damning. I began with a simple matrix. The horizontal axis represented time, 36 months of Sheriff Sheila's administration. The vertical axis listed every category of departmental spending: personnel, equipment, training, vehicle maintenance, office supplies, travel, and so on. Into this framework, I input every questionable expense I had identified, every duplicate payment, every inflated invoice, every emergency procurement that coincided with budget review periods. Each entry was color-coded based on the level of evidence: green for documented discrepancies, yellow for suspicious patterns, red for confirmed fraud. The result was visual and visceral. What had been abstract numbers buried in reports now became undeniable patterns. Clusters of red and yellow that intensified around certain periods, around certain vendors, around certain approval signatories. I added a second layer to the spreadsheet, a comparison between claimed expenses and market rates for the same goods and services. The sheriff's department had paid $1,200 for office chairs that retailed for $450, had approved $8,500 for emergency vehicle maintenance, when the actual invoice from the service center showed $3,700. The difference, nearly $60,000 over 3 years, had vanished into a bureaucratic void, authorized, documented, but never verified. I printed the final analysis and placed it in a sealed envelope labeled insurance. Not a lie. It was indeed insurance, just not the kind that covered property damage or liability. 3 days later, Emma burst into my home office, her eyes wide with excitement. "Dad, something is happening at the sheriff's office. Mike's mom works at the courthouse, and she said state officials arrived this morning with briefcases and laptops. They went straight to Sheriff Sheila's office." I nodded calmly, though my heart raced. "The wheels of justice turn slowly, Emma, but they do turn." "Do you think it has something to do with what happened to us?" she asked. "Perhaps," I said, unwilling to burden her with certainty. "Sometimes the universe finds ways to balance its own books." That afternoon, Patricia Wilson called from the diner. "Robert, thought you should know. State investigators are camped out at the sheriff's department. Sheila is stomping around town like a tornado looking for a trailer park. Word is, someone sent documentation to the state controller alleging financial misconduct." "Is that so?" I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Whatever you did," Patricia said, lowering her voice, "half the town is hopping at sticks. Just be careful. Sheila is making noise about outside interference and local troublemakers." I thanked her for the information and hung up. Then I backed up my files to an external hard drive and placed it in my safe deposit box at the bank. Precautions. Always precautions. The next morning, 2 patrol cars pulled up outside my house. Different deputies this time. Younger. Nervous. They knocked on my door with the tentative manner of men following orders they did not fully support. "Mr. Winters," the taller one said, "we have been instructed to conduct a compliance inspection of your home office, to ensure all business licensing requirements are being met." I smiled politely. "Of course, though I must inform you that my attorney has advised me to record any official visits following the seizure of my files last week. I hope that will not be a problem." I held up my phone, video already recording. The deputies exchanged glances. "That will not be necessary, sir," the shorter one said. "This is just a routine inspection." "Routine inspections are still official actions," I replied. "And in my experience, documentation protects everyone involved." They conducted their inspection quickly, perfunctorily, found nothing because there was nothing to find. My licenses were current. My office was in compliance with all zoning regulations. My business operations were, as they had always been, meticulously legal. As they left, the taller deputy hesitated on my porch. "Mr. Winters, off the record. Not everyone in the department agrees with how things are being handled. Some of us just want to do our jobs." I nodded, understanding the unspoken message. The facade was cracking, the loyalty wavering. Sheriff Sheila's command was beginning to crumble from within. That evening, a local news website published a brief article. "State Controller reviewing financial practices of Chester County Sheriff's Department." The article was cautiously worded, mentioning only standard procedural review and regular audit cycles. But I knew better. Knew that beneath the bureaucratic language, a storm was brewing. A storm of spreadsheets and bank records, of purchase orders and receipt confirmations, a storm that would wash away the carefully constructed edifice of Sheriff Sheila's financial manipulation. The following day, Sheriff Sheila called a press conference on the courthouse steps. Her uniform was crisp, her badge polished, but her eyes darted nervously as cameras focused on her face. Recent allegations regarding departmental finances are unfounded and malicious, she declared, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. This is nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by individuals with personal vendettas against law enforcement. Rest assured, when the state completes its review, our department will be vindicated. She did not take questions, did not meet the eyes of the reporters who called after her, simply turned and retreated into the courthouse, surrounded by her remaining loyal deputies. I watched the press conference from my office window, watched as the woman who had invaded my home, threatened my livelihood, and damaged my reputation now scrambled to protect her own. The spreadsheet had done its work. The numbers were speaking, and unlike witnesses who could be intimidated or evidence that could be misplaced, numbers do not bend to pressure, do not respond to threats. They simply exist, immutable and damning. Sheriff Sheila had spent years building her kingdom on financial deception. Now she would learn the most fundamental lesson of accounting. Every transaction leaves a trace. Every imbalance demands correction. And sooner or later the books must balance. The state controller's inquiry created cracks in the dam of silence. Small at first, then widening as the pressure of truth pushed against years of fear and compliance. Martin Cooper, owner of Cooper's Hardware, was the first to come forward. He arrived at my home on a Tuesday evening, his work truck parked a block away to avoid notice. 3 years ago, he said, sitting stiffly in my living room, Sheriff Sheila cited my store for 15 separate code violations. Fire extinguishers, exit signs, inventory spacing. Things that had passed inspection just months before. What happened? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. She suggested I could avoid the fines if I supplied the department with materials for their new training facility. At cost, no markup, no questions about quantities or delivery locations. He handed me a folder. Here are the invoices, materials that supposedly went to the training center, enough lumber and supplies to build 3 facilities. I thanked him for his courage, promised to include his documentation in my growing file. The next day, Lisa Martinez, owner of the local print shop, called. Sheriff Sheila had us print all her re-election materials last year, she explained. Campaign signs, mailers, brochures. The invoice was paid by the department credit card. When I questioned it, she said it was for community safety awareness and that the campaign logo was just efficient dual use of design work. I have copies of everything. More followed. A restaurant owner who catered department events that never happened. A mechanic who serviced patrol cars that were listed as decommissioned. A janitorial supply company that billed for cleaning products never delivered. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, another strand in the web of financial manipulation that Sheriff Sheila had woven throughout the county. Then came the call I had been waiting for, a woman's voice, hesitant and fearful. My name is Sarah. I used to work as a clerk in the sheriff's office. I processed purchase orders, filed expense reports. I saw things, did things I am not proud of. We met in the next county, at a coffee shop far from curious eyes. Sarah was young, maybe 25, with the haunted look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for her years. Sheriff Sheila had a system, she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. For certain vendors, we used a different approval form, one that did not require itemized receipts, just total amounts. She called them her courtesy vendors. said they had earned the right to simplified paperwork. And these vendors were. Sarah slid a folded paper across the table. Her brother-in-law's construction company, her campaign manager's consulting firm, a security equipment supplier owned by her former deputy. I studied the list, nodding names I had already flagged in my analysis. Did you ever question these arrangements? Sarah's laugh was bitter empty. Once, I asked why we were paying for office furniture that never arrived. The next day, my parking space was reassigned to the furthest corner of the lot. My performance review was suddenly concerning. My overtime requests were denied. The message was clear. Yet you kept notes, I said, indicating the documents she had brought. Self-preservation, she replied. I knew someday it would all come crashing down. I did not want to be buried in the rubble. She provided internal memos, department emails, handwritten notes from meetings where budget allocations were discussed. Not smoking guns individually, but collectively, they formed an arsenal of evidence. Will you testify if it comes to that? I asked as our meeting concluded. Sarah hesitated, fear and resolve battling across her face. If I have protection, if I know she cannot retaliate. The state controller has whistleblower protections, I assured her. And by the time this is finished, Sheriff Sheila will not have the power to retaliate against anyone. As I compiled these new statements, cross-referenced them against my financial analysis, the case against Sheriff Sheila evolved from suspicious patterns to documented fraud, from questionable ethics to criminal conduct. I forwarded each new piece of evidence to my contact at the state controller's office, each witness statement, each documentation of misconduct. The investigation was growing beyond simple financial review into potential criminal charges. Sheriff Sheila must have felt the walls closing in. Her public appearances became rare. Her statements, when they came, were defensive and increasingly desperate. She spoke of conspiracies, of enemies of law enforcement, of personal vendettas against her exemplary service. Few were listening anymore. The fear that had kept the town silent was dissolving, replaced by indignation, by a collective realization that they had been not just governed but exploited. Emma noticed the change as we walked through the town square one evening. People are saying hello to you again, she observed. Last week, Mrs. Peterson crossed the street to avoid us. People follow strength, I explained. For years, Sheriff Sheila appeared strong, untouchable. Now they see her vulnerability, her desperation. Because of what you did, Emma said, pride evident in her voice. I shook my head. Because of what the numbers revealed, I just knew where to look. That night, I received an email from the state controller's office. A single line that confirmed what I had believed from the beginning. Preliminary findings support further investigation into possible misappropriation of public funds. The whispers had become statements. The statements had become evidence. The evidence was becoming justice. Sheriff Sheila had built her power through intimidation, through the isolation of her victims. She never understood that in silencing individuals, she created potential witnesses, that in abusing her authority, she created motivation for resistance. Most importantly, she never realized that in targeting a man who understood the language of numbers, she had chosen the one opponent who could translate her financial deception into irrefutable evidence. The books were beginning to balance, and Sheriff Sheila would soon pay the outstanding debt she owed to justice. The Millfield Gazette was a small weekly publication that rarely covered anything more controversial than zoning disputes or high school football scores. So when the front page headline screamed, "Where did the money go? State investigates Sheriff's Department finances," It sent shockwaves through our community. The article, written by veteran reporter David Winters, no relation, laid out the preliminary findings of the state controller's investigation in careful, measured language that only made the accusations more damning. I read the article over breakfast, noting how David had pieced together information from public records, anonymous sources, and the controller's official statement. No direct mention of my involvement, no speculation about who had triggered the investigation, just facts, numbers, and questions that demanded answers. My phone began ringing before I finished my coffee. First Patricia from the diner, then Thomas the accountant, then a cascade of clients and neighbors, all asking if I had seen the news, all wondering what would happen next. The article had cracked open what had been, until now, a private battle between Sheriff Sheila and myself. Now the entire town was involved, invested, watching as the drama unfolded in public view. By noon, the county commissioners had called an emergency session. Though not open to the public, the agenda was clear, addressing the financial irregularities in the sheriff's department. By evening, a statement was issued demanding full transparency and immediate disclosure of all departmental spending records for the past 3 fiscal years. Commissioner Daniels, an elderly gentleman who had served on the council for over 2 decades, was quoted saying, "If these allegations have merit, this represents a fundamental breach of public trust. We need answers, and we need them now." The following morning, I walked through town to deposit a client's check. People nodded to me, some even smiled. The fear that had surrounded me since the deputies first appeared at my door was dissipating. In its place, a cautious respect was emerging, not for anything I had done but for the truth that was beginning to surface. As I passed the courthouse, Sheriff Sheila exited the building, flanked by Deputies Mills and Parker. She saw me, her eyes narrowing with recognition and rage. For a moment, we stood facing each other across the town square, the accountant and the sheriff, the accused and the accuser. "This is your doing," she called out, loud enough for passers-by to hear. "You think you understand how things work in this county. You have no idea what you have started." I did not respond, did not need to. Her public outburst accomplished what my spreadsheets and financial analyses could not. It showed everyone watching exactly who she was. A woman drunk on power, unaccustomed to being questioned, unable to maintain composure when challenged. That afternoon, Sheriff Sheila called her own press conference. Standing before the department flag, her uniform pressed and perfect, she projected an image of authority and control that was betrayed by the tremor in her voice. "Recent allegations regarding financial improprieties within my department are nothing more than a personal smear campaign orchestrated by individuals with a grudge against law enforcement," she declared. Robert Winters, a local tax preparer currently under investigation himself for possible fraud, has manipulated financial records and misrepresented standard departmental procedures to create the appearance of wrongdoing where none exists. She looked directly into the cameras, her finger pointing accusingly. "He is making this personal, using his accounting tricks to twist normal budget operations into something sinister. I assure the citizens of this county that every dollar spent by this department has been in service of public safety." Her statement shocked me, not because she had named me publicly, I had expected that, but because she had made a critical strategic error. By nomming me, by making specific accusations, she had opened the door for me to respond in kind. She had given me the stage. The town council meeting the following evening was standing room only. Citizens packed the chamber, reporters lined the walls, and tension filled the air like smoke before a fire. Sheriff Sheila sat in the front row, surrounded by her remaining loyal deputies, her expression a mask of professional indifference. When public comments were invited, I rose from my seat. The room fell silent as I walked to the podium, carrying a slim laptop and a folder of documents. I had not planned to reveal myself as the whistleblower, had intended to remain anonymous while the state conducted its investigation. But Sheriff Sheila had forced my hand, had made this personal. "My name is Robert Winters," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "For 23 years, I have served this community as a tax consultant and bookkeeper. My reputation, until recently, has been spotless. Then, 3 weeks ago, deputies arrived at my home with a warrant, seizing client files and accusing me of tax fraud. That accusation came directly from Sheriff Sheila's office, following my refusal to process a suspicious tax return for a relative of one of her deputies. I opened my laptop, connected it to the projection system. I am not here to defend myself. My records will do that. I am here to show you what I found when I decided to examine where our tax dollars have been going under Sheriff Sheila's administration." The first slide appeared on the screen, a simple spreadsheet showing fuel expenditures versus patrol logs. The discrepancies were highlighted in red. This chart shows fuel purchases for departmental vehicles exceeding actual usage by approximately 30%. Over 3 years, that represents nearly $20,000 in unexplained fuel expenses. The next slide appeared, equipment purchases. Here we see tactical equipment purchased and repurchased multiple times, with no record of the original items being lost, damaged, or decommissioned. Slide after slide, I walked the council and the audience through the evidence. Training programs that were paid for but never conducted, maintenance on vehicles that had been sold, office supplies purchased at triple the retail price from vendors with personal connections to Sheriff Sheila. The council members leaned forward in their seats. The audience murmured in disbelief. Sheriff Sheila's face grew tighter, paler with each revelation. "I am not an investigator," I concluded. "I am not a prosecutor. I am simply a man who knows numbers, who understands that ledgers must balance, that public funds require public accountability. The state controller is conducting an official investigation. I respectfully request that this council vote to initiate its own independent audit of the sheriff's department to restore public trust." Applause erupted from the audience. Not scattered, polite applause, but thunderous approval. People stood, cheered, called out support. Commissioner Daniels raised his hand for silence, then addressed Sheriff Sheila directly. "Sheriff Adams, would you care to respond to these allegations before we vote on Mr. Winters' proposal?" Sheriff Sheila rose slowly, her uniform suddenly seeming too large for her frame. She looked around the room, at the faces once cowed by her authority now staring back with expectation, with judgment. Without a word, she turned and walked from the chamber, the door closing firmly behind her. The council's vote was unanimous. The audit would proceed immediately, with full cooperation from all county departments. Sheriff Sheila would not even stay to hear the verdict, could not face the mathematics of her own actions. As I gathered my materials after the meeting, citizens approached to shake my hand, to thank me, to share their own stories of intimidation and abuse of power. The tide had turned, not because I had sought vengeance, but because I had simply shown the truth in the language I knew best. Numbers on a page, red ink and black, debits and credits that, when properly balanced, told a story she could not silence. The state auditors arrived on a Monday morning in 3 unmarked sedans. 6 men and women in pressed suits, carrying laptops and briefcases, led by a silver-haired woman named Eleanor Voss, who introduced herself as the chief financial investigator for the state controller's office. "We will require complete access to all financial records," she informed the county commissioners during their emergency session. "Bank statements, purchase orders, receipts, vendor contracts, payroll documents, everything from the past 3 fiscal years. We have authorization to review digital records as well as physical documentation." Commissioner Daniels assured her of full cooperation. "Whatever you need, Ms. Voss. Our priority is transparency and accountability." I watched from the back of the room, unseen, as the mechanisms of financial investigation began to turn. These were my people, methodical, precise, unemotional in their pursuit of accuracy. They would not be intimidated, would not be distracted, would follow the numbers wherever they led. The auditors set up operations in a conference room adjacent to the sheriff's department. Through connections I had developed during the investigation, I received regular updates on their findings. Each day brought new revelations, new confirmations of what my amateur audit had uncovered. The grant funds intended for community outreach programs that had been diverted to purchase office furniture for Sheriff Sheila's home. The emergency equipment fund that had somehow financed a fishing boat registered to her brother-in-law. The training seminars that existed only on paper, their budgets channeled into accounts controlled by Sheriff Sheila's former campaign manager. What had begun as financial mismanagement had evolved into something far more serious. This was not carelessness, not clerical error. This was systematic theft of public resources, executed with the confidence of someone who never expected to be caught. Deputy Harris, a young officer who had joined the force only a year earlier, approached me as I bought coffee at the local shop. His eyes darted nervously around the room before he spoke in a hushed voice. "Mr. Winters, I need to tell you something. The department is falling apart inside. Deputies are taking sides. Some still defend her, say you are making it all up. Others," he hesitated, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded manila envelope. "Others want the truth known. This is a log of equipment purchases from last year. The items marked in yellow were never delivered to the department, though payment was issued in full." I accepted the envelope, understanding the risk he was taking. "Why are you doing this, Deputy Harris?" He straightened his shoulders slightly. "I became an officer to protect people, not to protect corruption. My badge still means something to me." As the audit progressed, more deputies came forward. Some anonymously, leaving documents in my mailbox or sending emails from temporary accounts. Others openly defying Sheriff Sheila's order not to cooperate with the investigation beyond legal requirements. The state investigators uncovered 3 separate expense accounts in different banks, all tied to Sheriff Sheila through various proxy arrangements. Accounts where questionable departmental funds had been deposited, then withdrawn in cash, leaving no trail of how they were ultimately spent. She told us it was a special operations fund, one detective explained to investigators in a recorded statement. For confidential informants, undercover work, said the secrecy was necessary for officer safety. We believed her. Sheriff Sheila's command structure crumbled from within. Deputies who had once executed her orders without question now openly consulted with supervisors from other departments. Paperwork that had previously been processed without scrutiny was now examined carefully, with many forms returned for additional documentation. The sheriff herself became a ghost in her own department, arriving late, leaving early, avoiding public interactions. Her once pristine uniform showing signs of neglect, a missing button, a scuffed badge, creases where there had always been perfect pressing. During this period, I maintained my distance from the official investigation. My role as catalyst had ended. Now was the time for proper authorities to complete the process. I focused on rebuilding my practice, on recovering the client relationships that had been damaged by Sheriff Sheila's accusations. But I remained informed, remained vigilant, knew that cornered power rarely surrenders quietly. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. The department's IT specialist, a quiet man named Terrence who had maintained the computer systems for over a decade, provided investigators with email exchanges showing Sheriff Sheila had directed staff to create duplicate equipment inventory lists, one for auditors and one reflecting actual holdings. She made us maintain two sets of books, Terrence testified. She called it creative accounting for administrative flexibility. I did not understand the full implications until recently. Two sets of books, the cardinal sin in accounting, the definitive proof that these were not mistakes but deliberate acts of financial deception. By the third week of the audit, the findings had been transmitted to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential criminal charges. The investigators had compiled over 200 pages of documentation detailing misappropriation of public funds, falsification of official records, and potential tax evasion. Sheriff Sheila made one final attempt to maintain control. She called a mandatory department meeting, excluding any deputies who had cooperated with investigators. According to those present, her message was clear: stand together or fall together. This will all blow over, she reportedly told them. Auditors always find minor discrepancies. They make recommendations, we make adjustments, life goes on. Anyone who breaks ranks will not have a place in this department when the dust settles. But her words rang hollow in a room half empty, her authority diminished by the evidence mounting against her. The deputies listened in silence, no longer meeting her eyes, no longer responding with the automatic "yes, Sheriff" that had once punctuated her every command. Her badge, once a shield that protected her from consequences, had become a target identifying where accountability would strike. The budget she had manipulated for years was now burning through her remaining credibility, consuming her power with the implacable fury of exposed truth. The numbers, as they always must, were reaching their inevitable balance. The email arrived on a Thursday morning, its formal language masking the seismic shift it represented. Effective immediately, Sheriff Sheila Adams has been placed on administrative leave pending completion of the state financial audit and related investigations. Deputy Chief Michael Reynolds will serve as acting sheriff until further notice. The notification was signed by all 5 county commissioners, a unified front unprecedented in local governance. No dissenting opinions, no qualifying statements, simply the collective decision that Sheriff Sheila's authority had been suspended. Within hours, Acting Sheriff Reynolds issued his first departmental directive. All discretionary spending is frozen. All purchases, regardless of amount, require dual authorization. All overtime must be pre-approved with documented justification. Weekly budget reports will be submitted to the county commissioners and made available for public review. The speed of change was breathtaking. What had seemed impossible just weeks earlier, challenging Sheriff Sheila's authority, questioning her decisions, holding her accountable, was now happening with bureaucratic efficiency. The systems she had manipulated were being recalibrated. The power she had abused was being redistributed and regulated. The following day, the state attorney general held a press conference in the county courthouse steps. Standing before the assembled reporters and citizens, he spoke with measured gravity about the ongoing investigation. Based on preliminary findings from the state controller's audit, my office is actively reviewing evidence for potential criminal charges related to misappropriation of public funds, financial misconduct by a public official, and falsification of government records. While I cannot comment on specific details during this process, I can confirm that the evidence presented thus far warrants thorough investigation at the criminal level. Sheriff Sheila was nowhere to be seen. Her house, a stately colonial on the edge of town, appeared vacant. Her departmental vehicle had been returned to the county fleet. Her official email auto-replied with instructions to contact Acting Sheriff Reynolds. The transformation extended beyond the sheriff's department. County Commissioner Daniels, who had once signed off on Sheriff Sheila's budget requests without question, now requested itemized expenditures from all departments. Councilwoman Martinez, who had campaigned using Sheriff Sheila's endorsement, now championed a complete overhaul of financial oversight protocols. These former allies distanced themselves with the pragmatic efficiency of political survivors, realigning with the new reality where accountability was currency and transparency was strength. I watched these developments from the quiet of my restored practice. Clients had returned, some sheepishly apologizing for their temporary absence, others pretending they had never left. I accepted them all without comment, without judgment. Business was business. Fear was understandable. One morning, I arrived at my office to find a small bouquet of wildflowers placed outside my door. No florist arrangement, but field flowers picked by hand, black-eyed Susans, daisies, and Queen Anne's lace tied with simple twine. A small note accompanied them, handwritten on lined paper. "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us could not." The note was unsigned, unnecessary. The sentiment was being expressed throughout town in various ways: nods of respect as I passed, free coffee at the diner, an editorial in the Gazette praising citizen oversight of public institutions. Acting Sheriff Reynolds requested a meeting with me that same week. We sat in his office, formerly Sheriff Sheila's office, now stripped of her personal touches, the walls bare where her commendations and photographs had hung. "I wanted to apologize personally," he said, his weathered face solemn. "Many of us suspected things were not right, questioned certain decisions, but we convinced ourselves it was not our place to challenge her, that following orders was the same as doing our duty." He shook his head slowly. "We were wrong." I acknowledged his apology with a nod. "What happens now?" "Rebuilding," he replied. "Trust, protocols, reputation, all of it. The department will cooperate fully with every aspect of the investigation. Every question will be answered, every document provided. Then, whatever the outcome for Sheila, we start over. Better, more transparent, more accountable." The state investigation continued with methodical precision. Each day, new details emerged. The testimony of deputies who had been instructed to falsify patrol logs to justify excessive fuel purchases. The vendor who confirmed that Sheriff Sheila had demanded kickbacks on inflated contracts. The clerical staff who had been directed to shred documentation of questionable expenditures. These revelations no longer shocked the community. The pattern had been established, the character revealed. What had once seemed unthinkable, that our highest law enforcement officer was systematically corrupt, was now accepted fact, supported by mounting evidence. Sheriff Sheila herself remained silent, speaking only through an attorney who issued brief statements about procedural misunderstandings and administrative oversights. The woman who had ruled through intimidation now hid behind legal terminology and procedural delays. Justice was not swift. It was methodical, precise, documented. It moved with the steady pace of proper accounting, where every entry must be verified, every conclusion supported by evidence. But it was coming, as certain as the balance sheet must eventually balance, as inevitable as numerical truth. The powerful system Sheriff Sheila had exploited was now functioning exactly as intended, carefully, thoroughly dismantling her abuse of authority one documented violation at a time. The charges were filed on a Tuesday morning without fanfare or drama. 3 counts of misappropriation of public funds, 2 counts of falsifying official records, 1 count of official misconduct. The State Attorney General's office released a simple statement confirming that former Sheriff Sheila Adams had been formally charged following a comprehensive financial investigation. She surrendered herself to authorities in the neighboring county, avoiding the humiliation of being processed by the same deputies who had once followed her orders. Her mugshot appeared on the local news that evening, her face drawn, her eyes hollow, her expression a mixture of defiance and defeat. The town absorbed this development with somber satisfaction, not celebration, but affirmation that the system, however imperfectly and belatedly, could correct itself. That truth, when meticulously documented and properly presented, could overcome even entrenched power. The county commissioners convened a special session to address the financial policies that had allowed such abuse to flourish. I was invited to attend as a consultant, to offer perspective on how proper accounting controls might have prevented the situation. The fundamental issue was not the absence of rules, but the absence of verification, I explained to the assembled officials. Sheriff Adams did not break the system, she exploited its blind spots, the areas where trust replaced oversight, where tradition superseded transparency. Commissioner Daniels nodded gravely. What would you recommend, Mr. Winters? Monthly financial reports, publicly available, independent review of all departmental spending above a reasonable threshold, separation of approval and verification authorities, random audits conducted by external entities. I paused, then added the most important element, and protection for whistleblowers who identify potential misconduct. The commissioners voted unanimously to implement all recommendations, creating a new framework for financial accountability across all county departments. They established a state watchdog team to oversee municipal spending for the following year, ensuring the new policies became standard practice rather than temporary responses. Most surprisingly, they invited me to lead a newly formed financial ethics committee for the county, a role I accepted after careful consideration, not for power or influence, but because systems only work when people of goodwill participate in them, when expertise is applied to public benefit, when integrity is valued over expediency. The state prosecution moved forward against Sheriff Sheila with methodical purpose. Her attorney attempted to negotiate a plea agreement, reduced charges in exchange for resignation and restitution. The prosecutor refused. The evidence was too substantial, the violations too egregious, the breach of public trust too complete for compromise. Throughout this period, my accounting practice not only recovered but thrived. Clients returned, bringing new referrals. My reputation, temporarily damaged by Sheriff Sheila's accusations, emerged stronger than before. I was no longer just the reliable tax preparer, but the citizen who had stood against corruption when it would have been easier to remain silent. Emma noticed the change one evening as we reviewed college applications at the kitchen table. "People look at you differently now," she observed, "like you are some kind of hero." I shook my head. Not a hero, just an accountant who remembered what numbers are for. They are not just figures on a page, Emma. They are records of actions, of decisions, of values. When we keep honest books, we create accountability. She smiled, understanding in a way most teenagers would not. You fought with spreadsheets. The most powerful weapon is often the most precise one, I replied. Sheriff Sheila's trial was scheduled for the following spring, but the community had already delivered its verdict. The systems she had manipulated had been reformed. The fear she had cultivated had dissipated. The power she had abused had been redistributed and regulated. The most profound change was nearly invisible but universally felt, a restoration of trust in local governance. Citizens attended council meetings in record numbers, volunteered for oversight committees, engaged with public officials not as distant authorities but as fellow community members with specific responsibilities. One afternoon, I received an official letter from the state tax authority. It confirmed what I had always known. Their investigation into my practice had found no evidence of fraud or impropriety. My professional record was officially cleared, the false accusations formally dismissed. I framed that letter and hung it in my office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that systems, when functioning properly, eventually correct themselves. That truth, when supported by evidence, eventually prevails. The Financial Ethics Committee began its work with a thorough review of all municipal departments. We identified procedural vulnerabilities, recommended structural changes, and established training programs for financial oversight. The work was detailed, often tedious, but vital to preventing future abuses. At our first public forum, a local farmer approached me afterward. "What you did," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "showing us how to read between the lines of budgets and reports, that changed everything. We always believed some things were just too complicated for regular folks to understand. Now we know better." That was the true restitution, not just funds recovered or procedures reformed, but knowledge shared, power redistributed, citizenship reclaimed. The story that had begun with an accusation of tax fraud had evolved into something far more significant, a community's rediscovery of its own agency, its own responsibility, its own power to demand accountability from those entrusted with authority. Sheriff Sheila had built her kingdom on intimidation and financial deception. It had fallen not to violence or scandal, but to the patient, precise power of proper accounting, of balance sheets and budget lines, of numbers that, when properly aligned, told a story she could not control. The books had been balanced, the accounts reconciled, the truth restored to its proper place in the ledger of our community. The town hall was filled beyond capacity. Citizens stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, gathered outside where speakers had been set up to broadcast the proceedings. The Financial Transparency Forum, organized by the county commissioners, had drawn a crowd unprecedented for a municipal meeting. I adjusted my tie as Commissioner Daniels introduced me as the keynote speaker. The audience applauded, not politely but enthusiastically. It still felt strange, this public recognition, this transformation from private professional to public figure. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady though my heart raced. "I stand before you not as an expert or authority, but as a citizen who believes in the power of financial transparency. What we experienced in our community was not just the failure of one individual, but the failure of a system that allowed unchecked authority and unverified accounting." I surveyed the crowd, noting familiar faces: Patricia from the diner, Thomas the accountant, Deputy Harris, Sarah, the former clerk who had provided crucial evidence, and in the front row Emma, watching with evident pride. "Accountability is not about punishment," I continued. It is about clarity, about ensuring that what is promised is what is delivered, that what is spent serves its intended purpose, that what is entrusted is honored. I explained in accessible terms how financial oversight works, how budgets tell stories, how citizens can read those stories if given the proper context and transparency. I showed simple charts illustrating how our new systems created multiple checkpoints for expenditures, how separate individuals now had to verify each stage of financial transactions. What happened in our sheriff's department could happen anywhere authority operates without transparency, anywhere power exists without accountability. The solution is not just better rules, but better engagement. Citizens who ask questions, officials who welcome those questions, systems that prioritize verification over assumption. The audience nodded, engaged not despite the technical nature of financial oversight, but because of it. Because they now understood that budgets were not abstract documents, but detailed maps of priorities, values, and actions. After the forum, as people gathered in small groups to continue the discussion, Emma approached with a young man from her class. "Dad, this is Jason," she said. "He wanted to meet you." The teenager looked at me with awkward admiration. "My dad says you are the guy who took down the sheriff with nothing but a calculator." Emma laughed. "He is being modest. Tell him what you said at home, Dad." I smiled, remembering my comment. I told Emma that I did not take down Sheriff Sheila. The truth did. I just showed where to look for it. Jason shook his head. "Still, it is pretty cool. Everyone used to think accountants were boring. Now my math teacher uses you as an example of why financial literacy matters." I chuckled at the unexpected legacy. For years, Emma had been mildly embarrassed by my profession, had endured the teasing from classmates about her father being just a math guy. Now, apparently, that perception had shifted, not because I had changed, but because circumstances had revealed the power of what I had always done. Later that evening, I sat in my home office, reflecting on the journey of the past year, the false accusations, the investigation, the public revelation, the systemic changes, all originating from my refusal to file a fraudulent tax return and my decision to examine the finances of the woman who had tried to destroy me. I opened my desk drawer and removed a folder labeled simply "Proof." Inside was the original spreadsheet that had identified the first discrepancies in Sheriff Sheila's departmental spending, the document that had begun as self-defense and evolved into community service. I had kept it as a reminder, not of victory or vindication, but of responsibility, of the power of financial literacy, of the importance of systems that verify rather than assume, of the courage required to question authority armed with nothing but evidence and accuracy. Sheriff Sheila had faded from public consciousness. Following her conviction on all charges, she had received a suspended sentence and probation, contingent on restitution of misappropriated funds. She had moved away, seeking anonymity in a distant city where her name carried no history. What remained was not her shadow but her counterpoint, new leadership that understood service rather than control, new systems designed for transparency rather than manipulation, new civic engagement founded on participation rather than resignation. I closed the folder and returned it to the drawer. The past was documented, filed, preserved. But my focus now was forward, to the Ethics Committee's ongoing work, to the educational programs we were developing for civic financial literacy, to the culture of accountability we were nurturing in our community. Sheriff Sheila had believed herself beyond questioning because she wore a badge, had assumed her financial manipulation would go unchallenged because it involved complex bureaucracy, had trusted that intimidation would always overpower investigation. She had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of numbers, their patience, their precision, their permanence when properly recorded. She had tried to cook the books, but I had brought the receipts. And in the final accounting, truth had balanced the ledger.